You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Whatever your thing, it could be anything. Canva helps you make that thing a thing. Canva is a simple online tool thing. It's a way to design with our magic AI tool things. You can social media your thing, generate images or videos of your thing, make decks or presentations to show your thing. Whatever needs to be done for your thing, Canva can make it an even better and bigger thing. Canva, the thing that makes anything a thing.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, Listener Questions episode number 4. And with how this list of questions is looking, this will not be the last. We have a few big questions this time, including war aims, strategic bombing, and the economics of German occupation. As always, if you have questions you would like answered, you can send me those questions via email at historyofthesecondworldwar@outlook.com. Our first question comes from longtime listener Cecil. What were the war aims of each participant, and how did they develop over time? To what extent did they achieve those aims? Were the aims ever achievable? I know these develop over time and that leaders can be reluctant to talk about what they're trying to do, but what do we know? Finally, for the smaller powers, the countries that Germany and Italy conquered, or the countries like Hungary or Bulgaria that became co-belligerents, simply staying alive must have been their first priority. So I think there often is a desire to try and define war aims in a way that make them easy to understand and discuss, particularly when it comes to looking back through history. There's just something so comforting in being able to look at events in history and to give them a binary success or fail grade based on what they were trying to do and what they were actually able to accomplish. However, as often is the case, it's a bit more fluid than that. There were really two primary types of war aims throughout the war, those of defending countries and those of countries that were launching the attacks. For the defenders, the aims were often quite simple: stop the German invasion, and rarely did they move beyond that basic idea, even if they were successful. Almost all the countries that fell to German attacks in 1940 and 1941 would fall under this heading. Even larger nations like France was largely just concerned with ending German aggression and then hopefully finding a way to make it more difficult for Germany to launch another war in the future. Of course, these are not the nations that we're actually really talking about here. So let's start with some of the countries, like Hungary and Bulgaria. For these countries in Eastern Europe, they would enter the war primarily to try and reverse the defeats that had been suffered after the First World War. Territory had been taken from Hungary and Bulgaria and given to neighboring countries, either by the Paris Peace Conference or the agreements that were put in place afterwards. Their goals were often simple. They hoped to gain some of that territory back, territory they believed should be theirs anyway. Bulgaria did actually gain some territory after the war, although Hungary was not as lucky. The drastic changes within Eastern Europe after the war were things that very few of the countries in that region would have wanted before the conflict began, so I'm not really sure any small territorial gains could make up for the completely different political situation within Eastern Europe, at least from the perspective of pre-1939 decision makers who were at least mentally thinking about war aims and what they wanted to accomplish. The most important countries for this question are, of course, the primary aggressor states, Germany, Italy, and Japan. But while they are the most important, they're also the hardest to really answer. There were basic outlines of war aims. The Japanese wanted greater control of the Western Pacific and East Asia, which would provide them greater economic independence. Italy wanted to expand their control of the Mediterranean. But these were not clearly mapped out to exact territorial or strategic aspirations. The exact extent of Japanese plans were never perfectly clear, even when they began to be implemented in the 1930s and early 1940s. And their ever-expanding adventure in China is the best example of this. For the Italians, well, they were never really anywhere beyond the opening stages of what Mussolini wanted. And the exact end goals were always relatively vague. In both cases, the goals were theoretically achievable, but only if an enemy that they could not directly strike back against, the British and the Americans, simply gave up the fight at some point. In both cases, I would make the case that neither Italy nor Japan were ever close to achieving their aims because they were never particularly close to making their enemies surrender, and they could not directly attack their enemies directly due to simple geography, and so needing their enemies to surrender was the only real path to victory. Germany is in some ways the same, but in some ways completely different. The German war aims would expand just as fast as the territory under their control in 1940 and 1941. Lebensraum is always a big talking point with Hitler's push towards the war and bringing Germany along with him. The idea of expanding German territory was always important, and expanding in Eastern Europe was very important. And the belief that there would always be a war at some point with the Soviet Union was also a major part of German planning. But exactly how that manifested into war aims is more an evolution than an easy and straightforward statement. Every time there was a German success, the eventual goal would be pushed into the future. If you believe even a little bit of the rhetoric around what the Germans were saying from September to October 1939, their original goals were just to take Poland, and they would have signed a peace treaty with Britain and France if it had been offered. When that didn't happen, the goal became to defeat France and Britain, which was partially successful. They then went into the Balkans and North Africa to try and deal with the British problem, but in every case the belief was that eventually the real endgame would be an attack through the Soviet Union, and that is where the real war ending and the war aims would come into play. During the heady days of early 1941, and then through the early successes of Operation Barbarossa, the various German political groups would make a variety of different plans for how to occupy and order the East in the new German-dominated Europe. There were all kinds of horrible plans drawn up during this time, most of which involved allowing tens of millions of people to literally starve to death so that the land they lived on and the cities they lived in could be repurposed. Eventually, the Germans would establish a border along the Ural Mountains, and all the lands of Eastern Europe would be used as a massive colonial landscape where the German people could expand and grow, or at least that was the plan. There might still be some fighting along the borders, but that was well the way out in the Urals. That didn't really matter anymore. But these were not premeditated war aims, really. There were vague ideas before the war, the concept of Lebensraum and wanting the German people to be able to expand out into Eastern Europe. But it's not like Germany entered the war with Poland thinking about eventually setting up a German border at the Urals. They were very much making it up as they went along, which in many ways was a feature and not a bug. The aggressor nations, by and large, did not want to discuss direct war aims, because the instant they said something very clear and concise to their people and other people of the world, and then it was achieved, questions might start to be asked about why the war continued. Better to leave it vague and sort of unachievable. They were using what the kids these days would call vibes instead of war aims. I guess you could say the Allies had concrete war aims, beat Germany, Italy, and Japan. Even in those conversations, particularly when the Soviet Union was involved, planning and goals did not extend far beyond, just defeating the enemy until relatively late in the war. This will obviously be a topic that we revisit in later podcast series, but I hope this sort of begins to answer the question. It's a complicated one. It's not an easy one, and often deals in working through primary sources from during the war, often even non-public sources, so diary entries and things like that, to try and get some idea of what leaders were thinking, even if they didn't publicly admit the things that they were thinking at the time. Next up, we have one from listener Chris, who wants to dig in deep on strategic bombing. This is a long question, but I'm going to read it all before I answer because it's all sort of tied in together. Would you agree that the strategic bombing campaign in Europe would count as a failure if you take the Allied objective as being winning the war at as low a human cost as possible and as quickly as possible? Given the German industrial output continually expanding during the war, and the massive cost in resources and lives for the Allies, this surely has to be the case. I know historians argue that the Germans diverted resources to flak guns and fighters, but A, these were very good at destroying Allied bombers and killing their crews, B, they were just as useful for ground defense roles anyway, and C, the Germans did not divert as much as the Allies into bombing in terms of men, money, and resources. Surely, with the benefit of hindsight, the resources put into bombing could have been better spent using the men as infantry or fighter ground attack aircraft, and the industrial resources into other equipment, given the Allies were often lacking in many ways in infantry replacements, fighter shipping, etc. End quote. Every question about the strategic bombing campaign, its success, its failure, its impact on the overall course of the war, is going to eventually result in an answer that in some ways revolves around there being no real way to know if it was exactly the right move or not. I will save my own opinions to the end on this one, but we can work through some of the specifics of Chris's question one at a time on our way to that final answer. First up, German industrial output. Yes, Germany would create more tanks, aircraft, equipment, and ammunition during 1944 than any other year of the war. In fact, for tank production, they would almost produce more tanks during 1944 than the rest of the war combined, which is just a staggering number. 1944 would also be the year when the Allies would drop more tons of bombs on Germany than any other year of the war. In fact, it would be even more than every other year combined. These two facts are hard to reconcile when you just narrowly focus on industrial production output and then the impact of a strategic bombing campaign. More tanks than any other year of the war, and more tanks than the rest of the war combined, more bombing than any other year of the war, and more bombing than all of the rest of the war combined. However, there are two facts that can explain this kind of conundrum. The first was that the Germans were, quite frankly, not producing as much as they could have during the opening years of the war. Hitler and the other Nazi leaders were hesitant to cut down on the German standard of living, and so they strongly resisted the move to an appropriate focus of their resources on wartime production. It would only be after the defeats of late 1941 and early 1942 that this really started to turn around, and those changes and expansions would take time, peaking in 1944. In a similar vein, the Allies did not have enough bombers in 1939 to 1943 to launch the kinds of strategic bombing raids that they felt were necessary to ensure the defeat of Germany through strategic bombing. This made their bombing efforts small, ineffective, and, most importantly, inconsistent. This lack of consistency during the early war years cut down on the overall impact of the raids because they were simply given the Germans time to recover. It was only in 1944 that they were able to hit their peak, and it was only in that year that the Allies seemed to have gotten to the volume of bombs necessary to start having a major impact. Next up, there is the question of the resources that the Germans had to expend on defending against Allied bombing efforts. There can be no doubt that Germany put a lot of resources into the defense against the bombers, particularly as they began to focus more and more on German cities during the Middle War years, and those bombing raids began to have a major impact on German citizens. Aircraft were, of course, a big one, with thousands of fighters built specifically to attack Allied bombers, and countless anti-aircraft guns and munitions were being used to try and shoot them down. This is an area where the impact on the German war effort is quite clear. Those were resources that could have been used for some other purpose, and they were not because of the bombing campaign. You could debate if those resources, applied in some other way, would have changed the impact or the course of the war, but that gets really fuzzy really fast. The question to be asked around German resources is more around whether or not it was worth it to the Allies to spend their resources to make the Germans expend theirs. I think in this regard, my answer would be absolutely. The Americans had more men, more factories, and more industrial capabilities than the Germans did. And so if they could force the Germans into any kind of fighting where it was a battle of industrial output, the Americans would win. And of course, they had the British along to help them as well, and they were huge contributors. The question of opportunity cost of those resources is interesting, though. I'm of the belief that pre-1944, there was nothing better for the British and Americans to spend their money on. The American military was still growing, and what forces were available and trained were working their way through North Africa and then Italy. You could make the case that from a manpower to impact perspective, even with the losses suffered, this strategic bombing campaign was a great way to impact the war. As the effort grew in the late war years, things might become harder to justify, as I've seen numbers around 1 million for how many men in total were involved in the Allied side of the bombing campaign. Because remember, obviously there's the men in the bombers, but there's so many more on the ground supporting them, either at the airfields or in the transport infrastructure or in all the other areas that were keeping those bombs, dropping on Germany. Those absolutely could have been used for something else, although it's hard to know what greater impact that something else would have had in the push to eventual victory. One item that Chris did not mention in his question, but that I do want to point out, is that strategic bombing did serve an important part of the war effort for first Britain and the United States that was actually quite divorced from any conversation about its impact on the German war effort specifically. For the British starting in 1940 and going forward, it was one of the few ways that they could offensively strike against Germany. The British Army was not in a position to attack anywhere in mainland Europe after the spring of 1941, and therefore the only way to really do anything against Germany directly for the next several years was through bombing. For the Americans, it was the same in some ways. It took longer to get the fighting forces trained up and ready for action than it did to train a few hundred airmen to fly their bombers over France and then over Germany. It would allow the two countries to make an impact on the war sooner, which was important, particularly as the war continued in the Soviet Union, and Stalin and the other Soviet leaders were constantly asking for more assistance and for the Allies to do as much as possible in the West to distract Germany from their operations in the Soviet Union. Whether or not these intangible things were worth the effort and sacrifices, I don't really know. So pile it onto the scale of things it's impossible to give a definitive answer on, but that was an important part of the conversations that were happening about why these strategic bombing campaigns were happening. It's also worth noting that this question, this balance between was this campaign worth it, has been essentially asked since the very end of the war, even before the end of the war, and now for over 80 years the debate has been raging. Before the war ended, the United States would begin work on what would eventually be referred to as the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, which would see experts and researchers fanning out all over Germany in the months after the war in Europe to kind of figure out and try to determine exactly how effective the strategic bombing campaign had been over Germany. There were many criticisms of the survey. Information was gathered very quickly. There were Air Force officers involved in the analysis who were trying to justify the continued existence of the U.S. Strategic Bombing Force in the post-war years. And there was just general bias in a lot of the ways and a lot of the people involved. But the conclusions of the study are still important, with the result being that specifically targeting Germany's synthetic oil and transportation infrastructure had important impacts on the overall course of the war. These targeting campaigns would try to cut down on the ability of the German economy to function at all, robbing them of one of the only sources of oil in the late war years, so synthetic oil production, but more importantly, it involved heavily targeting German rail and water transportation. This resulted in a situation during the last months of the war in which even when the Germans had resources, they could not get them to where they needed to be. Both of these focus campaigns happened quite late in the war, both in the spring of 1944. So if those were the right targets, then the previous years of the war made suboptimal use of the available bombing resources, which could explain the ability of the German economy to continue production into 1944. Essentially, maybe the Allies were just doing it wrong until 1944, and that's why the German production continued to increase. While the Strategic Bombing Survey is an important document and does provide insight, it's thousands and thousands of pages of research and data, although most people just read the summary, which is like 138, I think, pages. It's not really the end of the debate, which is why we're here talking about this on a podcast today. Now, it is time for my opinion, though, and to be clear, I don't think there is an unambiguously correct answer here. I think that the strategic bombing campaign during the war was afflicted by the same problems that have plagued every strategic bombing campaign in history, and which can be seen in many other bombing efforts of the United States military over the decades. There was a tendency among strategic bombing advocates to grossly underestimate how many tons of bombs would need to be dropped to achieve a decisive result, and this impacted how they constructed the campaign and the goals as they tried to achieve the goals with the bombers available. Maybe if they had more realistic goals and targeting priorities in 1942 and 1943, they could have had more impact. Maybe if they waited longer to amass more bombers before trying. Maybe if they'd waited for long-range fighters to be available, like the P-51. Maybe. There's all kinds of maybes. We just don't have the sample size to know what might have worked. At the end of the day, I think the strategic bombing campaign was worth it for the Americans and the British. Not because it was necessarily perfectly effective, but because, given their geographic and economic positions, they could afford to use resources suboptimally as long as it contributed to final victory, and it forced the Germans to use resources in response. By 1945, the strategic bombing campaign had completely wrecked the German transportation system, its ability to manufacture anything, and the ability of its citizens to continue producing for the war effort. However, the mistakes made and what they were targeting, the American faith in precision bombing, the British adherence to area bombing, and just general planning issues, greatly reduced the impact that the bombers could have had. The bombers were overestimated in terms of their impact, and that changed how they were used. In the opinion of this podcaster, airborne bombing continues to be overestimated in terms of effectiveness even more than 80 years later. But that's sliding into current events and not history. I will end this answer by saying I don't think anybody is fundamentally wrong, regardless of whether or not they believe the strategic bombing campaign was worth it, or the best use of resources. I just don't think there can be a definitive answer. I don't think there ever will be a definitive answer. And so I believe that in another 80 years, people will still be discussing this. Those two answers were much longer than I expected when I started this episode, so we'll end on an easier, shorter one. This is from listener Luke. When you finished History of the Great War, you obviously had the Second World War to fall back on, but no Third World War has, hopefully, started yet. Do you have any plans as to what you're going to do next? I think it's too early for me to make any decisions about what comes after. As I mentioned in some of the History of the Great War episodes, the question episodes near the end, my plan was not to initially do the Second World War after the First World War, but it happened because I was too interested in the interwar years to stop moving the story forward after 1919. I'm not sure how I would feel at the end of this podcast, but that is also so many years in the future that I don't have to worry about it for a while. I'm honestly still just trying to determine how I'm going to make it through 1942 to 1944, given the scale of the war during those years. Multiple massive campaigns spanning the globe, constant action, so many other things that have to be discussed, like strategic bombing, the Battle of the Atlantic, life on the home front. The list is endless. If anybody has either a cloning machine, a time machine, or access to obscene amounts of money that I could use, please let me know. They could be helpful at solving this problem. And yes, hopefully there is not a Third World War that needs covering in the near future. However, on May 23rd at 10:19 a.m. Central U.S. time, I am far more concerned about the possibility of that kind of conflict than I was when I started this podcast in early 2020. As always, thank you to everybody who listens, and thank you to everyone who sent in a question. All three of you, I meant to get to more. You can send in your questions at historyofthesecondworldwar@outlook.com if you want them answered. Thank you, and have a wonderful week.